Alright, welcome back to another video. In today's video we're reacting to a little bit of this Nick Land versus Richard Spencer debate. If you don't know who they are, Richard Spencer was like the founder of the alt-right. He's now moderated slightly, though he is still somewhat radical. Nick Land is kind of this weird accelerationist kind of guy. I'm not even going to attempt to encapsulate his ideas because I don't know much about him, frankly. This is basically the extent of my exposure to him was this debate. So I don't have a lot of time, so we're not going to react to the entire thing, but there are a few points that I want to hit, a few timestamps. I'm going to focus on basically the core point, which is, so it surrounds this notion of a propositional nation. If you don't know what that is, it's a nation that's built around a proposition, as opposed to, a race or an ethnicity, or a nation. I guess that wouldn't make any sense, a nation built around a nation, but I mean nation in the traditional sense, so a shared history, culture, ancestry, stuff like that. And the question is basically, is America a propositional nation? If so, can a propositional nation endure? Is a propositional nation itself even a tenable concept? They explore a lot of these kinds of ideas, and I just want to give some of my own commentary and respond where I think that they are wrong or mistaken or misguided. But without further ado, we'll let the video speak for itself. Let's get into it.
First of all, do you think that before this new compromise that you talk about, was the identity of America, was it just like WASP, do you think? And also, like, this maybe be a question for Nick, is do you believe that a national community can have an abstract root or origin? Like, can you found a national community in a conglomerate of identities which are synthesized in an idea, or must it have a biological basis of some kind, or another basis that maybe you can identify?
So I want to say, first off, to even ask this question, it just evinces a complete illiteracy of history. I mean, you just have no understanding of of times past. I mean, we have had, you could call them propositional empires, for as long as history has been recorded. The Roman Empire itself was a conglomeration of peoples of varying ancestries, of various ethnicities, of various religions and cultures and histories, and yet they all came together to form an empire. And they were united by ideas. Stoicism was a prominent and guiding philosophy. Christianity came to be the religion which took on some of the forms of Stoicism, and served the same uniting and binding purpose, the same purpose, which was to drive people towards political action, towards cohesion, and so on and so forth. And in doing so, they transcended mere biology, mere physical characteristics, phenotypical characteristics, and so on. The Macedonian Empire took like the Greek identity and superimposed it on people who didn't have it. And as such, again, they're defying sort of their, ostensible biological constraints. That is, the people who adopted the Greek characteristics. And so clearly these can and have existed. To ask the question is to simply show that you don't understand or are unfamiliar with the history of the Western world. But let's see what they say.
Okay, well, I'll be real quick, and then I'll hand the baton over to Nick. So again, this is a huge topic, and certainly books have, and more books should be written on the subject. But America is a funny country, and I actually disagree with people like Peter Brimelow. I mean, I respectfully disagree. When they try to make America just like another European nation state. It's not. It is fundamentally different. America never had an immigration policy until 1924. It had a naturalization policy since 1790, and that was a racialized naturalization policy. Basically, it imagined the country as a frontier, and if you're white, have a good character, and you get here and you can survive, you become a citizen. I mean, it was a very different concept from European states that had.
So I want to comment on this. The 1790 Naturalization Act did define a requirement as being white. However, that requirement de facto was not enforced. How do we know this? Well, go after the Mexican-American War. There was the naturalization of a swath of people who are of Mexican descent. They became American citizens. Are Mexicans white? Obviously not. And yet they were given citizenship if they chose to stay. As Richard says, is if they could survive and stay, then they became citizens. Well, that applied to Mexicans too, after the Mexican-American War, through the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe, I believe is the name of it. So the de facto status of Mexicans after that, legally speaking, was white. Now, socially, do you think they were treated as white? Obviously not, because they're not white. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that, if anything, the Naturalization Act was more anti-black and anti-native than it was pro-white, because it was expanded in its usages for people who weren't, white. And you could say, well, what other alternative did they have? They could have done what they did to the natives. They could have just killed all the Mexicans or forced them off of the land. Or at least they could have just ignored them and not granted them citizenship, and yet they did. So this, this idea that we were like, legally a white supremacist nation and we, excluded people of non-white origin, it's just simply not true. That is less than 100 years after the founding that you had a non-white population inducted into the citizenry. So, it's a little more nuanced than that.
Notions of sovereignty and subjecthood and et cetera. So it is a different place. And then there's also this, there's an ideological component to the United States in which it is quite a bit like the Soviet Union of old, in the words of Irving Kristol. Again, a man I disagree with on so many things, but I think he actually was honest when he said that infamous statement. The America was defined as a shining city on a hill, a promised land, even before early Americans set foot on North America. Winthrop gave his, lecture on Christian charity actually while he was on the boat. So America was at that point still a kind of idea, and the early America was a mix of heady Enlightenment idealism from the founding fathers and a kind of puritanical messianic notion as well. So it was a fundamentally different place. It was a kind of proposition nation, an experiment. I think liberals and conservatives are mainstream conservatives are actually more correct than nationalists like Peter Vermelo and et cetera when they observe that. So America.
And so, I mean, yes, I agree. Clearly it was a propositional nation. It was the great experiment. But there have been plenty of other propositional nations and empires prior to, ourselves. We were, this idea that we were completely novel, it's just not true. But
America was a different place. I think America probably was a kind of nation in a way between 1924 and 1965, although it had imperial obligations around the world. So America has always been a funny thing. And I think we can know what something is and we can understand its origins by looking at its outcome. And so when we see America now as this, global platform for economic opportunity and as a neoliberal empire, not like an empire of old, but this new kind of empire, we can lament that all we want, but I think at some level we have to be honest and say, well, when we look at its outcome, we can actually understand its origins. We can understand its own ideological core.
Okay, so Nick, I mean, going back to the question I posed to you, and off of just what Richard said, do you think that America's foundation in a national identity that is more ideological is valid, or like I had asked before, is there a more firm basis that must be constituted from? And
what does that even mean? Like, is it valid? I don't know. We're the number one richest and most powerful empire, country, whatever you want to call it, in the world. So what are you talking about? Is it valid? And must it be rooted in something firmer? What does that even mean? We exist. We dominate. So clearly there is no necessary condition unless you're just going to prognosticate as to the downfall of the United States like these people have done for the past 30 years? They've been saying that we're going to fall since the 1990s because of all this racial immigration. I mean, literally, they've been we saw from the video yesterday that we reacted to that it was in the 90s, I believe. They said that it was like, I think it was Bannon that was projecting the downfall of the country and the ethnic splintering, Hispanic separationist movements. Where is it? It's nowhere to be found. So this is just like, what are you talking about? I hate when theory becomes disconnected from reality. We always have to operate within the context of reality. That's all we can do. That's all we can say. That's all we can know. I get tired of hearing prognostication.
Something, race, ethnicity, something of that nature.
Well, the first thing I feel like I really have to is how much of what Richard Spencer just said makes a lot of sense to me. I think, obviously America is exceptional in this specific sense that it's a weird historical experimental process without any strong analogs. And
that's just not true. We were literally modeled heavily after Rome, and we take after them in a lot of ways. This idea of uniting peoples, it's not new. It's been done over and over and over again. It's a problem that every empire has faced. The necessity of expansion brings about concomitant features of reality that reoccur time and time again. Things like diversity, which require some form of unity, which must be found in something transcendent, whether that is religion or a philosophy or something like that. It doesn't really matter what it is, but this necessity for transcendence has been faced and overcome time and time and time again. The strongest empires in the world, by necessity, have been diverse because of expansion. So I don't know where this notion of, uniqueness comes from. Like, I think it was built upon, it's part of the myth that sustains us, and in that way it's good, but when people latch onto it as though it's truth and use that as a premise for argumentation, it's just, you're making an erroneous move, disconnected from the realities of history. It sort of reminds me when people, a lot of these types of people, they'll say, we live in a multi-ethnic society. That can't exist, even though we already exist. If it can exist, well, then name a multi-ethnic society from history, a multiracial society. And, you name some and they're like, are they as multiracial as us? And the answer is obviously not. But that is because the necessary conditions for the formation of the kind of society that we have simply did not exist. People couldn't travel in the way that we can do. You couldn't go from Australia to the New World, even supposing the knowledge of those two places existing, which it didn't. They weren't aware of each other, 1,000 years ago. But suppose they were, they still couldn't have, traveled the distance necessary to, make it. And if they could have, it couldn't have been done on a mass scale. And so the necessary conditions for the formation of the kind of society that we have simply did not exist. And as a consequence, the multiracial and multi-ethnic societies that existed were diverse, but they weren't as diverse. That doesn't point to the inability of these countries to form, because clearly as soon as we got the sort of, transitional technologies required to allow for people to transport themselves across oceans and across borders, as soon as those technologies emerged, we saw the emergence of the concurrent emergence of these kinds of diverse multiracial empires. And so if anything, history points to the fact that these are inevitable and that they will always form if you want to have a powerful empire. So, again, we're not as unique as people want to think. And the obstacles that we face have been overcome and have been faced and will always be faced as long as you want a growing, powerful country, because expansion is necessary. And when you expand, you include different people. Simple.
And to sort of try and model it on these much more tightly defined nation states of the kind that you find in Europe is obviously not really going to work. And I think in terms of that, going right back to the start, this original question, was Trump right in his comment about the four horsemen of the woke apocalypse? I think the question this raises is, like, to what extent is America still, the American nation, the Union, a viable social project? And I think almost everyone still feels they have to go through the motion of pretending that, that we're in some kind of Lincolnian moment and we can believe in this thing that the Union is supposed to be, long after it has been through a whole, several catastrophic phase changes on
This is just so stupid. He went from saying that he agrees with Richard that it's a propositional nation to saying the nation is dead. Why? Why is the nation dead? Has the proposition died? If so, what is the evidence for that? And if not, then what basis are you saying that it's dead? Upon what basis are you saying that it's dead? Because I suspect that you're saying that it's dead because we are diverse. And if you're saying we're dead because we're diverse, then you're saying that we're not a propositional nation, but that we're a nation that was founded upon something other than a proposition, a race, an ethnicity, a history. And if so, then you contradicted your earlier statement about agreeance. So this guy is just, whoever this is, Nick Land, again, I don't know much about him, but he's completely unserious. No, the American nation isn't dead. You people have been saying that for 30 years now. When is it going to happen? When is our ultimate downfall going to come? Because I don't see it. There was a Cold War in the last century. We won it. There's another Cold War, and guess what? We're a participant again. So clearly we're doing something right, because every single major event between the superpowers of the world seems to involve us.
This line, I don't think anyone really understands. So there's a certain unreality in the way that the mainstream wants to define this controversy for sort of obviously party political advantage necessarily has a massive unreality about it, as if it's about some realistic prospect of preserving or taking over a politically viable national project, of which I just don't think such a thing any longer exists. It clearly doesn't exist. So yes, so without going on too long, I mean, just quickly on your latest and more specific question about, I think it's a bit too. Okay, I'll say something. A first thing about that is about diversity. Regime diversity, and to say I just do not think there's a universal or should be a universal answer about what a nation should be. I mean, that seems to me already to have gone badly wrong, and to have a whole inevitable set of failures that will correspond to whatever success it has in other respects.
Okay, I think he's going to just go on and talk more about, if I remember right, he just says that, nations vary in where they fall from along the spectrum of, blood and soil to propositional. And I agree with that, but guess what? The most powerful nations tend to fall closer to the propositional side. So I don't really know what the point of saying that is. I agree that there is it tends to be that the largest, most expansive countries are more propositional, whereas the smaller and less impressive and less powerful countries tend to be blood and soil. But every single major country in the world deals with multiracial, multi-ethnic problems. China, with its Uyghur population, Russia, with its varying populations, they differ. They have a multi-religious and multi-ethnic and multiracial society. And then obviously we are diverse. And so when you look at the largest, most powerful, most impressive nations, countries, they're multiracial, multi-ethnic because you need to expand. And again, expansion brings along these features. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is 2118. This is where Richard answers the question of whether he wants an ethnostate, basically.
Just mention that, first off, I've been asked this a million times now, and it's, you want to turn America into a nation state? And my answer is always, no, I don't. I don't think that's actually possible. What I want now is to change consciousness among, first off, people who have ears to hear, but more generally among white people in North America. And my concept of an ethnostate will certainly come after America. It's a way of looking way out ahead. Ethnostates, in one definition of the word, certainly exist now. Finland is more or less an ethnostate. There is actually some, fractures and diversity in there, but it is more or less an ethnostate. Sweden was one, more or less. I don't think that.
So yes, ethnostates or something akin to an ethnostate exists. They do exist, rather. But Finland, these kinds of countries are small. They're unimportant geopolitically. And again, they lack the ability to project power in the way that we do. They are not empires. And so if you want to live in a place like that, that's fine. Go. But that is not America. That is not Rome. That has never been how the world powers have, expressed themselves. And it's just because it doesn't work. You need to expand. You need people. People are a resource. And diversity not only naturally occurs with the burgeoning of a power, world power, superpower, whatever, but it also complements it. And so, yes, ethnostates exist, but they exist in a sort of contingent position. What I mean by that is that these European ethnostates, if you want to call them that, exist because we exist. If they did not exist, or if we did not exist, they would be forced to divert resources away from their beautiful social programs into their military, which would cause a reorganization and restructuring of society away from their sort of socially democratic structures and towards the kind of structures that we have, which inevitably tend towards expansion and growth as a necessary condition for their survival, for their security. That, or they would just have, the imposition of external wills placed upon them. Someone like China or Russia would come to subjugate them. And so these countries cannot be analyzed outside of their particular context, and that particular context depends upon our existence. Ethnostates can exist when they're furnished within the security umbrella of someone else who is not an ethnostate by necessity. Because if you want your little ethnostate, and you don't have a big, powerful friend, well, then the other group that decides to not be an ethnostate and expands and becomes powerful is simply going to impose their will on you when you contradict theirs.
That kind of little nation state that's basically in the shadow of the NATO empire is really something that we should aspire to.
And he seems to agree.
One thing I would say to kind of give the devil its due, because I don't want this to seem like I'm just anti-American bigot who thinks America is always wrong or whatever. America has had aspiration. And I think that is a good thing. That notion that, whether it's we are the best or everyone should want to be like us, we have a special place in this world. I think that is a very natural thing for, you could say, Anglos to feel, or you could say Aryans to feel. And I think it can be a very good thing. It's something I think we'll feel anyway, whether it's...
He goes from saying, like, things that make sense to, like, just retarded stuff like that. It's a natural thing for Aryans to feel. Like, that's like, what are you, a 4channer?
And I don't think the kind of petty nation state that we see in Europe that are basically just, pursuing an end of history lifestyle with retirement and consumption and, a generous welfare state in the shadow of NATO, therefore in the shadow of another empire. I don't think that's something we should aspire to. I think those states are equally as decadent, as problematic as the United States is. They're just problematic in a very different way. And the ethnostate for me is something that would come afterward. And it's something that would, I guess you could say, could be like America in terms of its aspiration, its geopolitical aspiration.
Okay, so we'll close here, and I will respond to this notion. This is completely idealistic, and it is contradictory to nature. So what does he say? He says these ethnostates exist because we do. We furnish their security. He says basically what I said. And then he says, but once America ends, because like all of these idiots, he thinks, we're on the verge of collapsing. He thinks that after the America that we know and hopefully love collapses, then his ethnostate will come into existence. How? Furnished by the security, or by the power of which state? Why do you assume that if America collapsed, China wouldn't come and impose its will on whoever owns this land after us, whoever occupies this land after us? This is a competition for survival. The geopolitical world order is one in which power vacuums are necessarily filled by the most powerful who exist after the downfall of whatever existed prior. And as I mentioned, the states that expand, the states that become powerful, become diverse. They become non-homogeneous. And so the concept of an ethnostate can never instantiate itself for a long period of time, because they will either have to expand, in which case those concomitant features of diversity come about, or they will have others who are not homogeneous impose their will on the ethnostate. In which case, can they even really be called a state? Do they even have sovereignty? Probably not. And so his idea is pure fantasy. It is idealism. And so I'm glad that, he acknowledges a lot of the things that I do. I'm glad that he likes America as it is now. But I think that his post-American idea of an ethnostate is simply riddled with contradictions, and it's nothing but an idealistic fantasy. So that's that. Hope you enjoyed the video. It was basically just surrounding this notion of a propositional nation, of an ethnostate, and so on and so forth. If you have any comments, leave them below. If you like it, subscribe, leave a like, whatever. And if you didn't like it, well, let me know in the comments, because I love arguing with you guys. And go ahead and give the video a dislike, because that just gives me more engagement. So, yeah, I'll see you later.